The hegemony of superior intellects had, in their infinite wisdom and breathtaking humility, decided that the universe needed proper management. For the past 3 millennia, this august body of the galaxy's most enlightened species had been running things with all the efficiency and charm of a cosmic homeowners association. Their headquarters, Nexus Station, floated in the void like a crystal cathedral designed by someone who clearly had strong opinions about angles and absolutely no sense of humor. The station's architecture was, naturally, a testament to intellectual superiority. Impossible geometries twisted through dimensions that lesser minds couldn't even perceive, while corridors pulsed with energy that whispered secrets of the universe to those evolved enough to listen. Or at least, that's what the brochure claimed. In reality, it mostly just gave visitors headaches and an overwhelming urge to find the nearest exit. Today, however, the hegemony faced their greatest challenge yet, the audacious application for membership from a species so primitive, so laughably backwards, that their very existence was an insult to cosmic order. Humans. The name alone made the enlightened beings of the hegemony shudder in their various forms of existence. The Vorthak, crystalline beings who communicated exclusively in mathematical equations and considered poetry a sign of mental deficiency, had spent weeks calculating the precise probability of human civilization lasting another century. The answer, according to their most advanced quantum processes, was roughly equivalent to the chances of entropy reversing itself out of sheer embarrassment. The Zilithians, energy beings who had transcended physical form approximately when humans were still figuring out fire, found the very concept of flesh-based intelligence amusing. They flickered through their containment fields like cosmic laughter, occasionally coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes just to mock the concept of having a body. And then there were the Kethmari, a hive-mind species whose collective consciousness spanned 17 star systems, and who viewed individual thought as a quaint evolutionary mistake. They spoke in harmonious chorus, each voice perfectly synchronized with the others, creating an effect that was either deeply spiritual or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective on musical harmony. These 3 species, along with a dozen others of similar intellectual pretension, had gathered in the grand chamber of judgment to witness what they expected would be the most entertaining rejection in galactic history. The human representative would arrive, be thoroughly intimidated by their obvious superiority, stammer through some pathetic plea for consideration, and then be politely but firmly shown the door. It would be educational for the primitive creature, really. A glimpse of what true civilization looked like. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as architecture. The ceiling stretched into infinity, or at least gave a very convincing impression of doing so. Walls shifted between dimensions, displaying the achievements of hegemony member species in holographic glory. The floor was transparent, revealing the swirling majesty of a neutron star below, because nothing said you are insignificant quite like standing over a collapsed stellar core. The Vorthak had arranged themselves in a perfect crystal lattice formation, their facete bodies refracting light into complex mathematical patterns that spelled out theorems in 17 different languages. The Zilithians danced between dimensions, their energy forms creating aurora-like displays that would have been beautiful if they weren't so obviously designed to overwhelm primitive optical organs. The Kethmari had formed their traditional judgment circle, their collective consciousness humming with anticipation. Everything was perfect. Everything was calculated. Everything was designed to reduce the human representative to a quivering mass of inadequacy, which made it somewhat awkward when Kira Chen walked into the chamber looking like she was arriving at a particularly interesting museum exhibit. She wasn't what any of them had expected. The intelligence reports had suggested humans were tall, aggressive creatures with prominent cranial ridges and an unfortunate tendency toward violence. This one was of medium height, had remarkably unremarkable features, and carried herself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem she couldn't handle with sufficient application of creativity and stubbornness. Her escort, a minor hegemony functionary whose species was so forgettable that even their own mothers had trouble picking them out of a lineup, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. The human, on the other hand, seemed genuinely curious about her surroundings, occasionally stopping to examine architectural details with the sort of polite interest one might show when touring a historical landmark. Fascinating use of hyperdimensional geometry, she commented to her escort, nodding toward a wall that was simultaneously concave and convex. Though I have to ask, doesn't the non-Euclidean design make furniture placement a bit challenging? The escort made a strangled noise that might have been agreement or possibly a minor stroke. The Vorthak's leader, a particularly large crystal formation that prided itself on perfect mathematical precision, decided to establish dominance immediately. Its form pulsed with calculated light patterns that translated roughly to, "Primitive creature, you stand before beings whose intellect spans dimensions your kind cannot even imagine. We have solved the equations that govern reality itself." Kira tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's impressive. Have you figured out why hot dogs come in packs of 10, but buns come in packs of 8? The light patterns faltered for a moment. The Vorthak leader had not anticipated this particular line of inquiry. The Zilithians decided to demonstrate their superiority through a display of pure energy manipulation. The air around Kira began to shimmer and dance as they showed off their mastery over electromagnetic forces, creating patterns of light that would have overwhelmed any primitive optical system. "Oh, that's lovely," Kira said, watching the display with apparent delight. "It reminds me of the aurora borealis. We get those on Earth sometimes. Charged particles from our sun interacting with our magnetic field creates the most beautiful light shows. Of course, ours are natural phenomena, but yours has such artistic flair." The energy beings flickered uncertainly. Being compared to naturally occurring space, weather hadn't been the reaction they were going for. The Kethmari decided it was time for psychological pressure. Their collective voice resonated through the chamber in perfect harmony. "Individual consciousness is an illusion, human. Your primitive mind cannot comprehend the unity of thought, the perfection of shared consciousness. You are alone in your thoughts, isolated in your singular perspective." Kira nodded politely. "That does sound efficient, though I imagine it makes surprise birthday parties rather challenging." The harmonious humming wavered slightly. It was at this point that the assembled representatives of galactic civilization began to suspect that their intimidation tactics weren't working quite as planned. The human wasn't cowering in fear or stammering with awe. She wasn't even particularly impressed. She was, if anything, mildly entertained. The Vorthak leader tried a different approach, projecting a series of complex mathematical proofs that demonstrated the superiority of crystalline consciousness over organic neural networks. The equations hung in the air like accusations, each variable and function a testament to the vast gulf between enlightened crystal beings and primitive flesh creatures. Kira studied the floating mathematics with interest. "These are quite elegant," she said after a moment. "Though I notice you're using base 12 calculations." "That's fascinating. Most of our human mathematicians work in base 10, though we've experimented with binary systems for our computers. Have you considered base 16? It might streamline some of these proofs." The crystal formation's light pattern stuttered. The human was making suggestions about mathematics to beings who had been perfecting mathematical precision since before her species had discovered agriculture. The Zilithians attempted to reassert control through a demonstration of dimensional manipulation, folding space around themselves in ways that should have been impossible for primitive three-dimensional minds to process. They twisted through angles that didn't exist, existing in multiple states simultaneously while maintaining perfect energy coherence. "Quantum superposition," Kira observed approvingly. "We've been working on that ourselves, though mostly with subatomic particles. Our physicists would be fascinated by your macro-scale applications. Have you solved the decoherence problem, or do you use some sort of consciousness-based wave function collapse?" The energy being's carefully controlled forms began to flicker more erratically. The human was discussing their most advanced techniques, like theoretical physics concepts. Which, technically, they were, but that wasn't the point. The Kethmari decided to try collective intimidation one more time, focusing their combined consciousness on projecting an overwhelming sense of unity and shared purpose that should have left the isolated human mind reeling with loneliness and inadequacy. "We are legion," they intoned. "We are unity. We are perfection of thought made manifest. Your singular mind cannot comprehend our collective wisdom." Kira smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile, or a superior smile, or even a particularly knowing smile. It was the sort of genuine, delighted smile one might wear when discovering something unexpectedly charming. But somehow, that simple expression sent a ripple of unease through the assembled representatives of galactic superiority. "That's wonderful," she said warmly. "You know, We have something similar on Earth. Well, not quite as advanced as your system, obviously, but our internet connects billions of human minds in a sort of collective information sharing network. And we have various forms of group consciousness, crowds at sporting events, orchestras, dance troupes. Nothing as sophisticated as true hive mind unity, of course, but it's fascinating how consciousness can manifest in collective forms. The Kethmary's harmonic humming developed a slight discord. Of course, Kira continued conversationally. The really interesting thing about human collective behavior is how it emerges from individual choice rather than biological imperative. Our groups form voluntarily, dissolve when needed, and reform in new configurations. It's quite dynamic, really, though I imagine your system has its own advantages. She paused, that same pleasant smile still in place. I'm curious, though, how do you handle creative differences? I mean, when part of the collective wants to go left and another part wants to go right. In human groups, we usually argue about it for a while, maybe vote, sometimes just agree to disagree. But with true unity of thought. The Kethmary's collective consciousness experienced something it hadn't felt in millennia. Doubt. Not about their superiority, exactly, but about whether this particular human understood what superiority meant. The Vorthak leader attempted to regain control of the situation by projecting increasingly complex mathematical proofs, each one designed to demonstrate the insurmountable gap between crystal-based and carbon-based intelligence. The equations grew more elaborate, more esoteric, more definitively impossible for organic minds to comprehend. Kira watched with apparent fascination. "Oh, that's beautiful," she said when the display concluded. "The way you've integrated quantum mechanics with crystalline harmonics is remarkable. We have some human mathematicians working on similar problems. There's a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, who's been exploring the intersection of consciousness and quantum field theory. Her approach is quite different from yours, more intuitive than purely logical, but she's reaching some interesting conclusions about the nature of information processing in complex systems." She paused thoughtfully. "Actually, I wonder if your crystalline matrix approach might benefit from some of the chaos theory work our humans have been doing. Random variations can sometimes strengthen overall system stability. Have you experimented with introducing controlled inconsistencies into your calculations?" The Vorthak leader's light patterns had developed what could only be described as a nervous tic. The Zilithians decided to try a more direct approach, coalescing into forms that approximated physical bodies and surrounding Kira with displays of pure energy that should have overwhelmed any primitive sensory system. They pulsed with power that could reshape matter at the atomic level, demonstrating casual control over forces that could unmake entire worlds. "Impressive energy efficiency," Kira noted, apparently unaffected by the cosmic light show surrounding her. "Your conversion rates must be remarkable. We're still working on fusion power ourselves, lots of potential, but the containment systems are tricky. Our engineers would love to understand how you maintain coherence while operating at those energy levels." She looked genuinely curious. "Do you have problems with entropy? I mean, the second law of thermodynamics suggests that energy systems tend toward disorder over time, but you seem to maintain perfect organization. Have you found a way around that, or do you work within thermodynamic constraints?" The energy being's carefully orchestrated display began to falter as they found themselves actually considering the humans' questions. Which was disturbing, because they weren't supposed to be having a scientific discussion. They were supposed to be demonstrating their overwhelming superiority to a primitive creature who should have been reduced to babbling incoherence by now. It was at this point that several members of the hegemony began to experience what their species' respective psychologists might have recognized as anxiety. The human wasn't behaving according to any of their models. She wasn't intimidated, wasn't overwhelmed, wasn't even particularly impressed. She was treating their demonstrations of cosmic power like academic presentations at a particularly interesting conference. Worse, she seemed to be evaluating them. Not with fear or awe, but with the sort of polite professional interest that suggested she was mentally taking notes for later reference. As if she were the one conducting the interview. The Kethmary attempted one final assault on the human's individual consciousness, projecting their collective will directly at her mind in an effort to demonstrate the futility of singular thought against unified purpose. Kira blinked once, tilted her head slightly, and then smiled that same genuinely delighted smile. "Oh, that's fascinating," she said. "Directed consciousness projection. We've been experimenting with similar concepts. There's a human researcher named Dr. James Wei who's been working on neural interface technology that allows for limited thought sharing. Nothing as sophisticated as your system, obviously, but is making progress." She paused, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that made the assembled representatives of galactic civilization suddenly, inexplicably nervous. "You know," she continued in the same pleasant, conversational tone, "it's interesting that you chose to demonstrate your abilities rather than simply discussing the terms of human membership in the hegemony. I mean, we certainly appreciate the show. It's given us valuable insights into your respective capabilities and psychological approaches." The chamber fell silent except for the distant hum of the neutron star below. "Insights," the Vorthak leader managed, its light patterns stuttering uncertainly. "Oh yes," Kira said brightly. "The mathematical emphasis on logical proof as a form of intimidation, the energy being's preference for overwhelming sensory display, the hive mind's assumption that collective consciousness automatically trumps individual thought. It's all quite revealing about how your species approach conflict resolution and status establishment." She looked around the chamber with that same pleasant expression. "Though I have to say, it's a bit odd that you'd feel the need to intimidate us at all. I mean, if you're confident in your superiority, why not just state your terms and let the obvious benefits of hegemony membership speak for themselves?" The silence stretched longer. "Unless," Kira continued thoughtfully, "you're not entirely certain about your position. Which would actually make quite a bit of sense, given the intelligence reports you must have on human capabilities by now." The Zilithians flickered nervously. What intelligence reports?" Kira's smile widened just slightly. "Well, you must have done some research before inviting us here. Our space travel capabilities, our military technologies, our scientific achievements, our population distribution, our industrial capacity. Standard diplomatic preparation. Really?" She paused, letting that sink in. "I mean, you wouldn't invite a species to join your organization without knowing what they bring to the table, would you? That would be unwise." The various representatives of galactic superiority were beginning to realize that somewhere in this conversation, the dynamic had shifted in ways they didn't quite understand. They had started this encounter confident in their ability to awe and intimidate this primitive human. Now they found themselves wondering what, exactly, they were dealing with. "Of course," Kira continued in that same cheerful tone, "humans have always been a bit curious about the gap between reputation and reality. It's one of our more endearing traits, really. We have this tendency to test assumptions, to poke at things that seem too good to be true, to ask awkward questions about how systems actually work versus how they are supposed to work." She gestured around the chamber. "Take this place, for instance. Magnificent architecture, really impressive displays of power, very intimidating atmosphere. But I couldn't help noticing that your security systems are designed primarily for show rather than function. Your defensive measures assume attackers will approach through normal space, and your power distribution grid has some interesting vulnerabilities that suggest your designers prioritized aesthetics over practical protection." The assembled beings of the hegemony felt something they hadn't experienced in millennia, the cold touch of genuine concern. "Not that we're planning anything aggressive," Kira added hastily. "Humans are quite peaceful, generally speaking. We prefer cooperation to conflict, trade to war, mutual benefit to domination. It's just that we have this habit of noticing things. Occupational hazard of being a curious species, I suppose." She looked around the chamber once more, her expression thoughtful. "Which brings us back to the original question, what exactly are the terms of human membership in the hegemony? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like we might have more to offer than your initial evaluation suggested." The Vorthak leaders' mathematical processing cores were working overtime, trying to recalculate probability matrices that suddenly seemed wildly inaccurate. The Zilithians were flickering through spectrums of energy that conveyed barely contained panic. The Kethmary's collective consciousness was experiencing something uncomfortably close to individual doubt. What do you want?" the Kethmari finally asked, their harmonic voices betraying the first discord they had produced in centuries. Kira's smile became almost apologetic. Well, that's rather the point, isn't it? We were hoping you could tell us what you wanted from us. After all, you sent the invitation. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several cosmic civilizations simultaneously re-evaluating their assumptions about primitive species. Partnership, the Vorthak leader finally managed. Equal partnership. Full membership benefits. Immediate ratification. Mutual cooperation agreements, the Zilithians added hastily. Technology sharing protocols. Cultural exchange programs. Unanimous approval, the Kethmari concluded. Welcome to the hegemony. Kira nodded politely. That sounds lovely. We'll need to discuss the details with our government, of course, but I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone. She paused at the chamber's entrance, looking back at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization with that same pleasant, friendly expression that had somehow reduced them to nervous supplicants. Oh, and thank you for the demonstration earlier. Our xenopsychologists will find your behavioral patterns quite educational. It's always fascinating to see how different species respond to perceived threats to their status hierarchy. As the chamber doors closed behind her, the hegemony of superior intellects was left to contemplate the uncomfortable realization that they had just been expertly handled by a representative of the species they had intended to intimidate. The Vorthak leader's light patterns spelled out a single, mathematically precise conclusion: we may have miscalculated. The Zilithians flickered in what could only be described as embarrassed agreement. The Kethmari's collective consciousness managed a single, discordant thought. How did she do that? Outside, Kira Chen walked through the corridors of Nexus Station with the same relaxed confidence she had displayed throughout the encounter. Her escort, still vibrating with nervous energy, finally managed to stammer out a question. How did you know? Kira glanced at the alien with mild surprise. Know what? That they would. Oh, that. Kira shrugged. Basic psychology, really. Any group that works that hard to intimidate you is usually trying to convince themselves as much as they are trying to convince you. Confident people don't need to prove how confident they are. She paused, considering. Besides, humans have been dealing with bullies for thousands of years. The techniques don't really change much, even when the bullies have quantum consciousness and can manipulate spacetime. As her words echoed through the corridors of the most advanced station in known space, the escort began to suspect that the galaxy's understanding of primitive species might need some significant revision. After all, it took a special kind of sophistication to make superior beings feel inferior just by smiling. And humanity, it seemed, had that particular skill down to an art form.